The sun over Raven Hollow had no mercy that day. Late summer heat pressed down on the crooked little town until even the wooden buildings seemed to sag beneath it. The dust along the main street hung heavy in the air, unmoving, thick enough to sting the throat. Folks said the land itself could judge a man harder than any law. But on that day, it wasn't the land passing judgment, it was the people. By noon, a crowd of 20 or so had gathered, boots scuffing the packed dirt, arms folded tight across their chests. Their faces were stiff, their voices low, muttering like flies that wouldn't quit buzzing. They'd come to watch, because watching was easier than questioning. And in the center of that street stood the reason for their silence: a young Apache woman tied to a rough wooden pole. Her name was Naomi, though in Raven Hollow they didn't call her by name. To them, she was just that Apache girl. She had dark eyes that didn't waver, copper skin that caught the sunlight like hammered bronze, and black hair that fell half loosened from a braid down her back. She couldn't have been more than 23, maybe younger. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, dirt-stained and bloodied at the seams. Rope bit into her wrists and elbows, pulling her arms behind her until the flesh turned purple. Her bare feet were cut and raw, streaked with dried blood from the rock she'd been dragged over. Yet she did not cry. She did not beg. Her swollen lip bled in silence, her bruised eye narrowing as she gazed past the crowd like they weren't even there. Every whisper, every cruel glance washed over her as if she had already left her body. And in a way, maybe she had. Because if she let herself feel the shame, the pain, the humiliation of being tied there for everyone's to see, then she would break. Pride was all she had left, and she clung to it with the strength of a dying flame. "She went with a white man," someone hissed near the back. "Didn't even try to hide it. Shameless." "She ain't ashamed now," another scoffed. "Look at her, standing like she still thinks she's worth something. She deserves this." The man they spoke of, the drifter Naney had followed, had vanished 3 days ago. He left without a word, and the town wasted no time turning on the woman he left behind. They didn't call for a trial. They didn't ask her side. They just tied her to a pole and left her to bake under the sun as a warning to others. Her crime wasn't murder, nor theft, nor violence. It was that she had given her company to a white man, and that she had stayed. Out beyond the edge of town, Luke Bradock spent the morning mending the corner fence of what used to be his ranch. Once, years ago, his name had carried weight in these parts. He'd run cattle and horses, worked the land with a steady hand, and carved out a piece of a life worth keeping. But the war took all that. He rode for the Union cavalry, saw men die on both sides, killed when he didn't want to, and buried more brothers than he could name. He came back broken, his faith in men spent, his voice turned to stone. At 41, Luke was tall and broad-backed, his face hardened by years of sun and dust. A faint limp marked his right step, a scar from the war that never quite healed. He wore the same duster coat day after day, unwashed but sturdy, and carried a revolver kept cleaner than his conscience. Folks in Raven Hollow didn't know him well, and he didn't give them reason to. He lived 2 miles out, coming into town only for flour, nails, or the bare necessities. That afternoon, he rode in as he always did, mule steady beneath him, boots dragging a little when he dismounted. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The second was the way every head was turned towards the square, Luke had seen enough of townsfolk gathering in silence to know trouble had taken root. He passed the blacksmith, the saloon, and came to a stop at the edge of the square. His eyes adjusted to the harsh light, and that's when he saw her. At first, she was just a figure tied to a post. Then his vision sharpened, and he caught the bruises, the torn dress, the tilt of her head heavy with exhaustion. Her chest rose shallow, her wrists swollen purple. Her body looked like it had already been thrown away. Luke stood still for a long 30 seconds, his jaw clenching tighter with every breath. He had thought himself beyond shock, beyond care, but something in the sight of her struck deep. Not just anger, but something heavier. Recognition, maybe. He'd seen too many people punished not for what they did, but for what they were. The deputy, a thin man trying hard to look in charge, stepped forward and blocked Luke's path. "Afternoon, Bradock," he said, half nervous, half defiant. "Town's got business today, ain't no concern of yours." Luke's eyes didn't leave Nanny. This what passes for justice now? "She broke a rule," the deputy said. "She's Apache. She bedded a white man. That's filth, plain and simple." Luke's voice came low and steady like a distant roll of thunder. "And the man?" "Gone," the deputy shrugged. "She stayed. That's her crime." Luke exhaled hard through his nose. His fists opened, closed once. He knew what he was looking at, and he knew the choice before him. He could walk away and let Raven Hollow have its spectacle. Or he could do the one thing he hadn't done in years, stand against the crowd. When he stepped forward, heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the square. The deputy raised a hand like he might stop him. But Luke kept walking, boots slow, deliberate. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't even shift her eyes. But when his knife cut through the rope at her wrists, her body slumped just slightly, trembling with the shock of sudden release. Luke caught her before she fell, steadying her with a hand under her elbow. And in that moment, the town saw something they hadn't expected. A man who lived in silence, choosing to break it. A loner who kept to himself, choosing to claim a woman the world had already cast aside. He didn't speak to them. He didn't owe them a word. He simply turned, helped her walk, and together they left Raven Hollow behind. What the town saw as shame, Luke Bradock saw as defiance. What Naomi felt as abandonment had just shifted into the faintest flicker of hope. And though neither of them could name it yet, that day in the dust and silence of Raven Hollow was the beginning of something neither had dared to believe in again. Luke Bradock didn't look back as he led Nanny out of Raven Hollow. The murmurs of the crowd faded behind him, swallowed by dust and distance, but the weight of their stares followed like shadows. Her steps were shaky, bare feet dragging against the dirt, but she didn't resist him. She didn't ask where they were going. She just walked because standing still meant death, and following meant maybe something else. His land lay 2 miles out, a stretch of sunburnt soil and sagging fence that once held cattle, back when the world still made sense. The war had stripped it of its purpose, just as it had stripped him of his. Now, what remained was a leaning barn, a dry garden, and a cabin that carried more silence than comfort. Luke never thought to share it with anyone again. But that day, he brought her there. Not to the cabin, but to the old cattle shed, the only spare shelter left standing. He opened the door and glanced inside. Dust drifted in the beams of light cutting through a small window. Bare walls, a dirt floor, nothing more. Still, it was shade, and it was quiet. He turned to her, his voice low. "You can stay." Nanny stepped inside without a word. She lowered herself slowly against the far wall, the blanket of dust puffing around her as she sat. Her eyes were hollow, unreadable, but not broken. Luke studied her a moment longer, then left her there. That night, he carried a folded blanket to the shed. He set it near the door without stepping inside. Beside it, he placed a tin cup of water and a hunk of bread. She didn't look up, didn't thank him. He didn't wait for her to. He turned back to the cabin, boots dragging across the yard, and settled into his chair by the cold hearth. But his chest was tight, tighter than it had been in years. He'd seen death, seen worse than death, and thought himself beyond being bothered. Yet the image of her tied to that pole, ropes, biting into bruised flesh, her head bowed but unbroken, wouldn't leave him. He rubbed at the scar along his thigh, stared into the dark, and wondered why this one woman had unsettled him more than a battlefield full of dying men. In the shed, Nanny sat with the bread in her lap, her fingers trembling but her jaw set. The water steadied her throat, but it did nothing for the hollow inside. She thought of the man who'd left her, the one she'd followed across dry miles because loneliness felt heavier than danger. She thought of how quickly the town had turned, how quickly they'd made her body into a warning. He didn't think, and yet here she was, not dead, not abandoned completely. She did not understand. This man Bradock, this broad-shouldered loner who'd cut her down. But she understood one thing. If he meant her harm, he'd have done it already. Luke lay awake most of the night, listening to the wind tug at the shed's roof. His mind turned restless, circling the same thought. What next? He hadn't asked for company, hadn't wanted responsibility. And yet when he pictured Raven Hollow's pole, but without her tied to it, the thought steadied something in him. She was his problem now, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. Morning came slow, the sky pale gray before the sun rose over the hills. Luke stepped out with a tin of coffee in his hand. The cabin door creaked behind him, hinges stiff with rust. He stood on the porch staring toward the shed. She hadn't come out. He hadn't expected her to. After what they'd done to her, trust would not come easy. Still, she hadn't run either. That meant something. He walked the yard with the limp he no longer noticed, carried a basin of water to the shed, and opened the door without knocking. She was there in the corner, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, hair hanging forward like a curtain. Her face was swollen, her lip cracked deeper, but her eyes lifted and met his, flat, unreadable, but steady. "You need water?" he asked. She didn't respond. He set the basin down, placed a clean rag beside it, a spoon and a slice of salted pork. Then he stepped back, leaving the door open just long enough for the morning light to stretch across the dirt floor. He didn't press her for thanks. He didn't ask her story. He simply closed the door and let her decide what to do with the offerings. By midday, she stepped out. Luke was at the fence line, hammering rail into place, sweat cutting trails through dust on his face. He heard the creak of the shed door and looked up. She walked barefoot, blankets still over her shoulders, dress torn and hanging low in places she didn't bother to cover. Her steps were careful but deliberate. She stood 10 feet away and finally spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Why?" Luke paused, set the hammer down, and wiped his hands. "Why what? Why'd you cut me down?" His eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "You were going to die." "I didn't ask you to help me." "I know." She stared at him longer, her hands clutching the blanket like armor. "I didn't do anything wrong." Luke's eyes softened, though his voice stayed flat. They don't care. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he nodded towards the rain barrel. Clean water there. Use what you need. She moved slow, limping slightly, dipped the tin cup, and drank in a small sips. She glanced at him once, sharp, almost questioning. He didn't step closer. That evening, she sat near the fire pit outside. Luke brought her a stool and half a plate of beans and pork. She accepted it with both hands, still avoiding his gaze. When she finished, she set the plate down neatly and rose. You got a name? He asked. Nanny, she answered. He nodded once. I'm Luke. She hesitated, then said, I know. And she turned back toward the shed. Luke sat long after she'd gone, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes fixed on the shed door. He hadn't expected her to stay this long. He hadn't expected to care. But now she was here, and the silence he once thought he needed no longer felt the same. For the first time in years, the land didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath. Luke rose with the sun, as he always had, tending fences, feeding the mule, keeping his hands busy so his mind wouldn't wander. But now there was a presence he couldn't ignore, the shape of Naini moving through his yard, the whisper of her bare feet against dry earth, the silence she carried like a second skin. Idi, she never asked for the cabin, never once stepped toward it. The cattle shed remained her shelter, and she kept her distance except when the work demanded otherwise. But she stayed. That was the thing Luke couldn't shake. After what the town had done, after the shame they tried to bury her under, she could have run off into the hills, vanished before he woke. Instead, each morning, she stepped out again, shoulders squared as if daring the land to test her. At first, she spoke little, only a word here, a nod there. But Luke began to notice the small signs of her will. How she folded the blanket each morning with careful precision. How she placed tools back in order without being told. How she carried herself like someone who had learned long ago not to depend on kindness, but refused to give up dignity. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, Luke brought her a plate of beans. She sat on the top step of the porch with her knees drawn close, eating slow, deliberate. When she finished, she set the plate neatly beside her, wiped her hands on her dress, and looked out across the dry stretch of earth. Her voice was quiet when it came. I didn't love him. Luke, seated in his chair nearby, turned his head slightly. The man? She nodded once, eyes still fixed on the horizon. I just didn't want to be alone. The words struck deeper than Luke expected. He thought of long winters in the cabin, of nights staring at the dark ceiling with only his scars for company. He thought of the woman he might have married, the life that might have been lost to time and silence. His throat tightened. He ground out the stub of his cigarette in the dirt. You're not alone now, he said finally, voice low. She turned her face toward him, eyes dark and unreadable. Am I not? He didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what kind of answer she needed. So he sat in the silence with her, letting it be enough. The next morning, Luke rode into town before dawn. He didn't tell her why, he just saddled his mule and set out, hat brim low, coat trailing in the dust. Raven Hollow was still stirring when he reached the general store. He bought flour, salt, oats. And then, without a word to the shopkeeper, he added a folded brown dress from the second-hand rack. He didn't let the man's raised eyebrow slow him. He paid, tucked the bundle into his saddlebag, and rode out without looking back. By the time he returned, Naini was hauling water from the barrel. He left the dress folded by the shed door and said nothing. She found it that evening, ran her fingers over the plain cotton, and said nothing either. But the next morning she stepped out wearing it. Clean, simple, modest. It draped loose over her frame. The bruises on her face had begun to fade. Her hair was combed smoother, her presence less ghost and more flesh. That night, as they sat near the fire, Luke spoke first. Didn't mean anything by it, just figured you needed something better to wear. I know, she said simply. She didn't thank him, but she didn't walk away either. She stayed by the fire longer than usual, eyes tracing the flames, shoulders loosened just enough to suggest a shift. Luke sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the glow paint her face. He felt something in him ease for the first time in years. Later that week, she joined him on the porch uninvited, blanket around her shoulders, sitting cross-legged on the top step. The night was cooler, the wind brushing loose strands of her hair across her cheek. Luke smoked in silence, watching the stars prick open above the horizon. She didn't ask for a cigarette, didn't ask anything at all. Just sat near enough that he could hear the rhythm of her breathing. After a long while, she broke the quiet. They said I betrayed both sides. The white man left me. My people would have cast me out for being with him. The town made me an example, no place left. Luke stared out at the dark line of hills. I've been a man with no place too. Her eyes flicked toward him, searching. And now? He shifted, the old ache in his leg flaring as he leaned forward. Now I stay here. Land's mine. Quiet's mine. That's enough. She considered that a moment, then nodded once. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the bruise along her jaw. She looked younger in that light, but also older, like someone who had carried too many years of judgment in too short a life. When she rose to go back to the shed, Luke expected her to walk away without another word. Instead, she paused at the door, glanced over her shoulder and said softly, "Good night, Luke." It was the first time she'd said his name. Luke sat long after she disappeared inside, his chest heavy with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace, not yet, but something close to it. A beginning. He didn't fool himself. He knew the town would not forget. They'd come again, sooner or later, angry that he'd defied them, angrier still that she was still alive under his roofline. But as he sat with the night pressing close, he realized he didn't care. Not anymore. She was here. She had chosen in her own quiet way to stay. And for the first time since he came back from the war, Luke Bradock felt the faint stirrings of a reason to fight. Not for a flag, not for a cause, but for someone who had already lost everything, yet still found the strength to stand beside him. The rhythm between them settled in quiet, unspoken, like two streams running side by side without ever needing to cross. Luke worked the fences, patched the sagging barn wall, and kept the mule fed. Naini rose early without being told, moving with the precision of someone who had learned to survive by staying useful. She gathered eggs from the two hens still laying, swept the shed clean, hauled water until her arms trembled. She never asked for praise, never sought permission. She simply worked. Luke noticed the way she moved, shoulders always tight at first, like she expected someone to bark orders or snatch a tool from her hand. But when he passed her a hammer or held a rail steady, she didn't flinch anymore. That alone felt like progress. She was learning the shape of his silence, and he was learning the weight of hers. They still ate apart more often than not, but sometimes she sat on the porch steps with him, sharing beans and cornbread in the fading light. She didn't talk much, only spoke when she had reason, but her presence was enough. Luke found himself watching her without meaning to. The way her forearm brushed sweat from her temple, the way her hair slipped loose from its braid by evening, the way her dark eyes studied him when she thought he wasn't looking. It unsettled him, not with lust, but with something deeper, something that threatened the walls he'd built since the war. He wasn't sure he had the strength to let someone that close again. And yet, every day she stayed, those walls felt less like protection and more like a cage. One evening, she joined him without being asked. She carried her blanket to the top step and sat cross-legged, hair loose around her shoulders, face softened by the glow of lantern light. They watched the night settle over the land, coyotes yipping in the distance, the air cooling with each breath. Luke smoked in silence, letting the smoke curl into the sky. She watched the embers. After a long pause, she spoke. "The man I followed said he'd come back for me." Her voice was flat, without bitterness, just a statement of fact. "He was a drifter, gave me a name that probably wasn't his. I believed him until he left while I was sleeping. Then the town found me." Luke exhaled smoke through his nose, slow and steady. He didn't answer right away. "I didn't love him," she added. "I just didn't want to be alone." Something in Luke's chest tightened. He thought of nights staring into the fire, the hollow echo of a cabin too empty. He thought of his brothers, one never returning from battle, one turning a gun on himself, the last drinking himself into a ditch. He thought of the woman who hadn't waited, who had married someone else when she thought Luke was dead. He had told himself for years that he didn't care, but hearing Nanny speak her loneliness aloud cracked something inside him. "You're not alone now," he said quietly. She turned her head toward him. "Am I not?" Her words weren't a challenge, but a question heavy with years of being left behind. Luke wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her she was safe now, that he'd stand between her and anyone who tried to hurt her again. But he stayed silent, afraid that promises would sound too much like lies if spoken too soon. Instead, he nodded toward the stars. "Not while I'm here." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, then she looked back at the sky. They didn't speak again that night, but when she rose to leave, she paused at the shed door. "Good night, Luke." The sound of his name in her voice stayed with him long after she disappeared inside. The next morning, Luke saddled the mule before dawn. He didn't tell her where he was going, just rode out, steady into Raven Hollow. The town was slow to stir, but men still looked at him as he passed. He tied off at the general store, bought flour, oats, salt, and then, after a long hesitation, picked out a plain brown cotton dress from the second-hand rack. He didn't let the shopkeeper's raised eyebrow draw a word from him. He paid and left without comment. Back at the ranch, he left the dress folded by the shed door. She found it that afternoon, ran her fingers over the cloth without expression. The next morning, she wore it. Simple, modest, a little loose at the waist, but clean. Luke said nothing, but when she stepped out, her bruises fading and her hair combed smooth, she looked less like a ghost and more like herself. That night by the fire, he finally spoke. "Didn't mean anything by it, just figured you needed something better to wear." "I know," she said simply. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. She stayed beside him longer than usual, the silence between them less heavy, more like company. As days turned into weeks, the rhythm of their lives settled deeper. She moved through chores with quiet resilience. He worked beside her when the labor was heavy. And in the evenings, when the fire burned low, they sat side by side, neither speaking much, but neither pulling away. Luke knew the town hadn't forgotten. He knew their silence wouldn't last. But he also knew something else, that if the town came again, he wouldn't stand aside. Oh, not this time. And in her stillness, in the way she lingered on the porch steps, in the way her eyes met his without flinching, Naomi seemed to know it too. She hadn't chosen to stay with him out of fear or desperation anymore. She was staying because she wanted to. For Luke Bradock, a man who had lost brothers, a woman and a war, that quiet choice was heavier than any vow. And for Naomi, who had been shamed, beaten, and cast out, it was the first taste of belonging she had known in years. The land was still dry, the fences still sagging, the cabin still scarred. But between them, something had begun to grow. Not promises, not declarations, just presence. Just staying. The days slipped into a kind of rhythm. Neither of them had spoken aloud, but both had accepted. Naomi rose early, shoulders straight, hair pulled back, her steps light across the yard, as though she'd been born to move unnoticed. She gathered eggs, swept the shed, hauled water, and began mending his old shirts with precise stitches that spoke of patience learned hard. Luke let her be, offering no orders and giving no praise. But in the silence, he noticed every small thing. The way she folded her blanket neatly each morning, the way she placed tools in order after use, the way her hands, though scraped raw at the knuckles, never trembled when they worked. Luke himself kept to his chores. He repaired the fences where the rails sagged, cleared brush from the dry irrigation ditch, and stacked firewood in neat piles against the cabin wall. By sundown, he always left a portion near the shed without comment. She never asked, never thanked, just carried the wood inside. The unspoken exchange became its own language, stronger than words either of them trusted. But silence carried weight too. At night, Luke sat on the porch with a tin of coffee cooling in his hands, staring at the stars while Naomi's shadow moved faint behind the shed window. Some nights she left the door cracked open just enough that the creak of it in the breeze reached his ears. He noticed every time, and every time he sat longer on the porch, wrestling with the part of himself that wanted to cross that short stretch of dirt. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of needing again. Naomi felt it too. She didn't speak of it, didn't invite him directly, but her movements carried a new steadiness. She no longer kept her eyes averted when he passed her tools. She no longer flinched when his shadow crossed hers. When she worked beside him, hauling brush or pulling weeds from the dead garden patch, she allowed the silence between them to soften. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something else, something that hinted at belonging. One evening, while the fire pit glowed low and the smell of beans hung in the air, Naomi sat close enough that her shoulder brushed his sleeve. She said nothing at first, just watch the flames dance. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "I didn't do anything wrong." Luke turned his head, studying her profile in the firelight. Her jaw was tight, her eyes distant, but her voice held more weariness than anger. He let out a long breath through his nose. "They never care about that." Her lips pressed together and she nodded once. that was the whole of their conversation, but it was more than they'd shared before. It was the first time she had spoken her wound aloud, and the first time Luke had given her the truth of his own heart, that justice rarely mattered in places like Raven Hollow. The next morning she surprised him. As he walked past the shed with a pail of water, she was already outside, bent over the garden patch, turning the soil with a broken-handled hoe. He stopped, watching the sweep of her arms, the set of her jaw. "You think anything'll grow?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Not this year, but I'll turn the dirt anyway." "You know how to farm?" She stood, wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. "I know how to survive." Her words cut through him deeper than she intended. Survive. He'd been doing the same year after year with no thought of living beyond it. Now she was here, bent over his soil, her bare feet pressing into the same dust he had walked alone for too long. And the word survival suddenly felt smaller than it used to. By sundown, she had cleared half the patch. Her dress clung to her with sweat, her braid falling loose, but she didn't slow. Luke brought her water, set it down without a word. She drank in long gulps, eyes lifting to his just once. For the first time, she didn't look away immediately. That night, when the porch lantern flickered low, she sat with him again. The air between them carried a weight unspoken but undeniable. He thought of asking her why she stayed. He thought of telling her he wanted her to. Instead, he said only, "You worked hard today." Her lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "So did you." It startled him, that smile. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something alive, something he hadn't seen on her face before, and it stirred in him the memory of who he used to be before war, before loss, before silence. When she rose to leave, she paused at the shed door and looked back. The lantern light caught the shine in her eyes, soft but steady. "Good night, Luke," she said again, her voice warmer this time. "Good night, Naney," he answered. As the door closed behind her, Luke sat with his coffee gone cold, heart beating heavier than it had in years. He had not asked for her to stay. She had not begged to remain. And yet, in the quiet exchange of labor, in the simple act of sharing the day's wait, they had both chosen something neither dared name. The town would come again, he knew. Men like Keller wouldn't let this stand. But for now, the land was theirs, the silence was theirs. And in that fragile space, something new had begun to root. Luke leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the stars overhead. For the first time since the war, he wasn't waiting on ghosts. He was waiting on tomorrow. And tomorrow didn't feel empty anymore. The days stretched long and hot, the kind of heat that pressed on a man's chest until even breathing felt like labor. Yet in that heat, a rhythm had taken hold on the Bradock place, unspoken but steady. Nini rose early without needing to be asked. She moved with a quiet purpose, gathering eggs, sweeping the shed, hauling water from the barrel with arms that had grown stronger since she first arrived. Luke saw it in the set of her shoulders, in the way her steps no longer faltered in the dirt. Survival had sharpened her, but now something else was taking root, something that looked a little like belonging. Luke kept to his work as he always had, but the weight of solitude no longer pressed as heavy. He split wood in the mornings, patched the sagging barn, repaired fence rails that leaned with age. And every time he passed her tools or steadied a beam she lifted, he felt the strange comfort of her nearness. She didn't chatter, didn't fill the silence with needless words. She simply worked beside him, and in that, Luke found a kind of companionship he hadn't believed possible again. By sundown, they often sat near the fire pit or on the porch steps. At first, Nanny kept her distance, but slowly she had begun to drift closer. Sometimes, their shoulders brushed when they sat, and neither pulled away. Sometimes she lingered after the fire burned low, her blanket wrapped around her, watching the stars in the same silence Luke carried inside himself. He had grown used to that silence. Now, it didn't feel empty. It felt shared. One evening, as they shelled beans at the porch table, Naomi spoke without looking up. "I used to live near the Salt River. My father raised goats." Luke paused, listening, his rough hands working slow. "You still got family there?" "They were moved," she said quietly. "San Carlos. I ran before they gathered the rest." He didn't ask why. He knew some truths didn't need pressing. Instead, he nodded once, heavy and sure. She glanced at him then, her eyes steady but carrying that old wound of someone who had been cast out of every place she tried to stay. "And you," she asked, "you lost your land?" "Kept a piece of it," Luke answered. "Sold the rest when the cattle died off. Drought took what the war didn't." "And you stayed?" "I didn't see the point in leaving." Nanny studied him, her lips curving just slightly. "Tom, you don't talk much." "I say what needs saying." "I noticed." Luke allowed himself the faintest smirk, rare and gone as quick as it came. For a long moment they both looked down at their hands. His scarred and broad, dirt ground into every crease, hers scraped and raw, but steady. The world beyond them was still cruel, still waiting to judge, but here on this porch, in the glow of a low fire, there was no judgment, just presence. That night, as they rose from the porch to return to their beds, something passed between them. She didn't step away first this time. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes less guarded than before. "Do you miss her?" she asked softly. Luke's jaw tightened. "Who?" "The woman you almost married." He hesitated, breath catching. "Some days. Not in the way I used to." Her gaze didn't waver. "Because of me?" "No." He swallowed hard. "But since you came, it feels less like I'm waiting on ghosts." Nanny stood still for a long second. Then she whispered, "Good night, Luke," and walked back toward the shed. Luke sat on the porch steps after she left, the echo of her words still heavy in his chest. He hadn't meant to let her in this far, hadn't meant to let his heart stumble towards something he thought was long gone. But there it was, quiet, steady, undeniable. The next morning he found her barefoot in the garden patch, bent over the soil, trying to coax life from the dry ground. Her braid hung loose, dress clinging with sweat. He stopped at the edge of the patch, shovel resting in his hand. "You think anything will grow?" "Not this year," she said, not turning. "But I'll turn the dirt anyway." He studied her for a long moment, then asked the question that had been pressing at him. "Did he hurt you, the man who left?" Nanny straightened slowly, her eyes finding his. Silence stretched long. Then she said, "No." "But he didn't protect me either." Luke's jaw clenched. He gave a single nod. That was all he could offer, though inside something twisted. Anger slow and steady at the thought of a man, leaving her to the cruelty of others. Later, that evening, he brought out his spare revolver, wrapped in a cloth, and set it on the porch table between them. "If trouble comes," he said, "you should know how to use it." Her eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to him. "You think he'll come back?" "Someone will," Luke answered. "They didn't like me taking you, and they won't like you staying." Nanny reached out. her fingers brushing the revolver. She handled it like someone who'd known it before, checking the cylinder, testing the weight. She looked up, meeting his gaze steady. "You going to teach me again?" "You don't need teaching," he said quietly. She studied the weapon another moment, then set it aside. "Then maybe just company." That night she lingered on the porch. Long after the fire burned low, Luke sat with her, the silence between them alive with something unspoken. When she finally stood, he did too. The wind lifted through the dry grass, carrying the sharp scent of sage. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his, and then, without a word, she leaned in and kissed him. It was not rushed, not desperate, just a soft, steady press of lips that lingered like breath. She pulled back, eyes steady. "I don't owe you anything," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I'm still here." Luke nodded, his chest heavy but sure. And for the first time in years, he let himself smile. Small, brief, but enough. The kiss lingered in the air between them long after she slipped back to the shed. And as Luke sat beneath the stars, heart still beating with the echo of her touch, he knew something had changed. This was no longer just survival. This was choice. The kiss changed things, though neither of them spoke of it. It lingered in every glance, every pause, every brush of fingers when tools passed between them. Luke didn't chase her, didn't press for more, but the memory of her lips stayed with him in the long quiet of the night. And Naini, though she still slept in the shed, no longer closed the door fully. She left it ajar, just enough for the soft creak of wood in the wind to carry to his ears. Luke noticed every time his body ached to cross that small distance, but he sat on the porch instead, wrestling with the old fear of needing someone, of losing again. By day, their rhythm continued. Naini worked with the same resilience she had from the start. But something had shifted. She no longer avoided his eyes when she carried water or stooped to weed the dry patch of soil. She moved beside him with a steadiness that spoke of trust hard won, of fear easing its grip. And Luke, though he fought to keep his distance, began to watch her more openly. He noticed the way her hair caught the sunlight when loose, the strength in her shoulders when she hauled wood, the curve of her hands when she mended cloth with precise stitches. One evening, as dusk spread copper across the horizon, she surprised him by speaking more than a sentence. They sat on the porch, with beans in their bowls, the air cooling after a long day's heat. She held her spoon still and said, "The man I followed. Do you want to know who he was?" Luke studied her, his broad hands resting on his knees. "Only if you want to tell it." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground. "He was a drifter. Gave me a name that wasn't his, I think. Said he'd come back. I followed too far. And when he left, the town found me. They called me a traitor. Said I betrayed both sides." Luke's throat tightened. He ground his spoon into the dirt, the old ache of anger rising. "You didn't betray nothing. You just wanted to live." Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze. "I didn't love him. I only wanted not to be alone." Luke turned his face away, staring at the far hills, shadows stretching long in the fading light. "You're not alone now," he said. Her voice dropped low. "Am I not?" Luke didn't answer. He couldn't. Because what she needed wasn't a promise spoken quick under the stars. What she needed was proof, day by day, choice by choice, that he wasn't going to turn away like the others. The next morning, before dawn, Luke saddled the mule and rode into Raven Hollow. He didn't tell her where he was going, just left his coffee half drunk on the porch and disappeared down the trail. The town eyed him as he tied off near the general store. He bought oats, salt, and nails, and then, without explanation, added a second-hand dress to his order. He ignored the shopkeeper's stare, paid in silence, and left. Back at the ranch, he left the dress folded by the shed door. She found it that evening and said nothing, but the next day she wore it. Clean, simple cotton, a little loose at the waist, but modest and whole. Her bruises had faded to faint shadows, her hair combed smooth. She looked less like someone discarded and more like someone beginning again. That night she sat beside him longer than usual. When the fire burned low, she asked softly, "Did you lose someone in the war?" Luke shifted, elbows on his knees, eyes dark with memory. 3 brothers. One never made it back. One shot himself. The other drank himself dead in a ditch. And the woman I meant to marry, she didn't wait. Naomi lowered her eyes, voice quiet. "She thought you were gone." "She didn't wait long enough to find out." Silence settled thick between them. Then she leaned into her folded legs, her shoulder brushing his sleeve, and didn't move away. Luke felt it small, simple, yet heavier than any vow, a presence that spoke louder than words. She was still here. Days passed into weeks, the heat pressing hard, but their bond growing stronger. They worked side by side, each carrying the weight of the land, each learning to lean into the silence as if it were shelter instead of emptiness. Luke found himself watching her not with hunger but with reverence. Every small act of resilience, every laugh that slipped loose when she forgot to guard it, every way she carried herself, like she had something worth standing for again. And Naomi, though scarred by abandonment, began to see Luke not as another man who would leave, but as a man who stayed. His hands, scarred and calloused, always moved careful around her. His silence was not indifference, but a kind of steadiness she had never known. He did not demand. He did not press. He simply remained. One evening she joined him on the porch without a word, blanket tucked around her shoulders. The stars spread wide overhead, and Luke smoked slow, the ember glowing between his fingers. After a long silence, she whispered, "I don't want to run anymore." Luke looked at her, his eyes steady, voice low. "Then don't." She turned her face toward him, dark eyes shining faint in the starlight. And for the first time, she let the truth fall from her lips without fear. "I want to stay." Luke's chest tightened, but he nodded once, sure and heavy. "Then stay." It wasn't a vow, not in the way of preachers and books, but for Luke, Bradock and Naomi, 2 souls the world had tried to discard. It was more binding than any paper. And as the night deepened, as the fire burned to embers and the coyotes howled in the distance, they sat side by side, shoulders touching, both knowing the truth that silence no longer held them apart. It held them together. The night she whispered she wanted to stay, and something inside Luke shifted. It wasn't loud, wasn't sudden, just a slow breaking of the dam he'd built inside himself for years. The words had come soft from her lips, but they struck harder than any bullet he'd carried home from the war. He didn't answer with promises, didn't offer speeches. He just nodded once, heavy and certain. And for Naomi, who had been thrown aside by every hand that touched her life, that was enough. But the kiss that followed days later was not the soft brush of lips they had shared once before. It was deeper, steadier, the kind that asked nothing but gave everything. She came to him that night, not with desperation but with choice. Luke remembered the way her blanket slipped from her shoulders, how her braid loosened as she set the comb aside, how her eyes met his without flinching. He had said it plain before, he wouldn't take anything she didn't give. And she had given herself, fully, without hesitation. They didn't speak much through it. Words would have only cluttered the truth. She undressed herself slowly, not as a lure, not as shame, but as if she were laying down a weight she'd carried too long. Her skin bore faint bruises, scars hidden under cloth, the marks of a world that had treated her body as something to punish. Luke didn't stare like she was an object, didn't grab like she was a possession. He touched her like she was human, like she was whole. And for Naney, that was enough to undo years of silence. Theirs was not the frantic heat of youth, but the slow breathing of two people who had known loss and still chose to reach for something more. Luke pulled her against him as if holding her could steady the ground beneath his boots. She climbed into his lap with a surety that startled him, her arms around his shoulders, her weight against the scars he'd once hidden. When he entered her, she didn't cry out or shrink away. She only pulled him closer, her breath warm at his neck, as if she had been waiting not for the act itself, but for the tenderness that came with it. Afterward, when the fire had burned down to ash and the night hummed low around them, she lay against his chest, her palm pressed over the old scar near his ribs. Her whisper was soft, barely a breath. "You're not like them." Luke's throat tightened. He bent his head, kissed her hair, and answered in kind. "You're not what they said you were." That night she stayed in the cabin, not because he asked her to, but because she chose to. And when he woke at dawn to the pale gray light creeping across the floor, she was still there, curled beneath his blanket, her hair spread across the pillow. He lay quiet for a long while, watching her breathe. He had not thought to wake beside someone again, yet here she was, and the silence no longer felt heavy, it felt alive. The days that followed carried the same rhythm of work, but now there was something more woven into it. Naini still rose early, still carried water, still worked the soil with stubborn strength, but she also moved through the cabin, as though it had begun to belong to her too. She folded blankets without being told, swept the corners, left his tools in order by the door, and at night she returned not to the shed, but to the bed they now shared. Luke noticed the difference in himself as well. He kept the rifle closer, checked the hinges on the cabin door, reinforced the shutters. He knew the town hadn't forgotten. He knew Keller and the others were waiting for the right moment to make their move. But he also knew one truth, steady in his bones. If they came, he would not let them take her. Not while he was breathing. Naney carried her own resolve. One evening, as they sat near the fire pit, she said quietly, "If they come again, I won't run." Luke looked at her, the firelight catching her dark eyes. "You sure?" She nodded once, her jaw set firm. "I've run enough." Her words settled deep in him. He realized then she wasn't just surviving here. She was choosing this life, choosing him. That knowledge steadied him more than anything since the war. Later that night, she stood at the wash basin, hair damp from rinsing the dust, the blanket loose around her shoulders. Old Luke stopped stacking wood just to watch her. She caught him staring and tilted her head. "You look too long," she said. "I try not to," he answered. "Then why do it?" He stepped closer, voice low. "Because you're here? And I didn't think I'd want someone again, not like this." She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached for his hand and placed it against her cheek. He kissed her again, slower this time, but with the certainty of a man who had stopped running from himself. He carried her back to the cabin, and beneath the lantern's low glow, they came together once more, not as strangers clinging to survival, but as two people who had found something rare on the edge of a harsh world, something worth staying for. When dawn broke, Luke found her beside him still, her body curled into his, her breath steady. He kissed the top of her head and whispered, "You belong here." And for the first time in her life, Naini believed it. For a while, the days carried a fragile kind of peace. Naini moved through the cabin now as though it were hers as much as his, sweeping the floor at dawn, mending his shirts by the hearth, laying tools in their places after chores. Luke found her presence steadying. The quiet hum of her breath beside him at night cutting through years of emptiness he'd thought permanent. But peace on the frontier never lasted long, and both of them knew it. The first sign came in the shape of two riders on the southern trail. Dust rose behind their horses as they slowed near the gate. Luke was splitting wood by the porch, sweat darkening his shirt across the shoulders, when he spotted them. He set the axe down, lifted his rifle from the porch rail, and rested it across his arm. Naini stepped out of the cabin barefoot, a bowl in her hands, but froze when she saw who it was. Deputy Keller sat tall in his saddle, lean and stiff, his eyes fixed sharp on the cabin. Beside him was Emmett Thorne, the feed store man, older, his hat pulled low against the sun. "Morning, Bradock," Keller called, voice carrying the weight of false authority. "Got a word?" Luke didn't move from the porch. "Say it from there." Keller shifted in his saddle, his jaw tight. "Town council says you're harboring someone don't belong. Apache Woman's got no place here." Luke rested his rifle a little higher on his arm, his face stone. "She belongs here now. That ain't your call. It is on my land." Naini stood behind Luke in the doorway, her arms folded tight against her chest. She didn't flinch under Keller's stare, though her hands trembled just slightly where they clutched her elbows. Luke glanced at her from the corner of his eye, then back at the men. "You've said your piece, now ride on." Keller's eyes narrowed. "This ain't finished. Folks are talking. Let them talk." Luke's voice came low, final. "But you ride onto my property again without need. I'll take it as a threat." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thorne tipped his hat toward Naini, his eyes tired but not cruel, and nudged his horse to turn. Keller spat into the dirt, his glare sharp as glass, and followed. The riders disappeared back down the trail, leaving the air heavy behind them. Naini stepped down onto the porch, her bare feet dusted from the boards. "They'll come back," she said quietly. Luke lowered the rifle but kept his eyes on the horizon. "I know." "You scared?" He turned to her, his jaw firm. "Number, but I see in your hands that you are." Her fingers loosened slightly, betraying the tremor she had tried to hide. Luke reached for her hand, calloused palm closing steady over hers. "Then stay close," he said, "whatever comes." She nodded once, and together they walked back into the cabin. That night, Luke sat at the table, rifle across his lap, cleaning the barrel by lamplight. Naini moved quietly behind him, sweeping the hearth, her movements tight, focused, like she needed the work to keep her fear at bay. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't distance, it was preparation. The next afternoon, Luke took her out past the southern ridge. The air there was cooler, shaded by cottonwoods. He carried a saddlebag with 2 rifles, a box of shells, and a tin of oil. He handed her the smaller rifle. "If they come, you need to be sharp." She took it without hesitation, checked the barrel, tested the weight against her shoulder. Luke watched as she raised it, her stance firm, her grip sure. "You remember?" he asked. "I never forgot." He set rusted tin cans along the fence posts and nodded. "Go ahead." Her first shot spun a can clean off the post. The second dropped another. Luke grunted quiet approval. "Good." She lowered the rifle, exhaling steady. "They didn't teach me for sport," she said. "It was survival, raiders, soldiers, strangers who came at night." Luke didn't answer right away. Then, voice low, "You ever kill anyone?" Her eyes flicked to him once. "I was 15. He tried to drag me off a wagon near Mescalero. I aimed careful." Luke nodded slow, his jaw tightening. "Always aim careful." They practiced until the sun dipped low. Then they sat in the shade, sharing jerky from the tin. Sweat clung to their skin, her braid sticking damp against her cheek. After a long silence, she asked, "Did you think about it? Cutting me down that day?" "Every night since," Luke said. "Why'd you do it?" He looked out across the dry valley. The horizon burned red by dusk. "Because I'd rather have you near than stay scared of needing someone." Her lips curved faint, a shadow of a smile. "I felt that." That night when they returned, Luke stacked the rifles by the cabin door. Naomi moved inside, lit the lamp, and set supper on the table. As he sat across from her, he saw it, the steadiness in her eyes, the resolve beneath her quiet. She wasn't staying out of desperation anymore. She was staying because she had decided to. And for Luke, who had buried brothers, lost a woman, and spent years drowning in silence, that choice was heavier than any vow. Later, as they lay together in the dark, her body pressed against his beneath the blanket, she whispered, "If they come again, I won't run." Luke kissed her hair, his hand resting over hers. "Then we'll stand together." And though both of them knew the trail back to Raven Hollow still carried threats, neither looked back. They had crossed into something real, and for the first time, Luke Bradock felt ready to fight. Not for war, not for country, but for the woman who had chosen to stay. The days after Keller rode off were tense, the air around the cabin thick as storm clouds that refused to break. Luke kept his rifle closer than ever, leaned it against the table where his hand could find it blind in the dark. He reinforced the shutters, hammered an extra latch on the door, and dug shallow trenches near the field's edge. Nene noticed, though he didn't speak of it. She moved with the same quiet purpose, tying her hair back tight, folding blankets in order, setting aside food and bandages, as if she had prepared for this kind of waiting all her life. Neither of them said aloud what they both knew, that the town would not leave them be. The first shot came at dawn.
Mm-hmm.
Luke was in the barn feeding the mule when the crack split the silence. Wood splintered off the outer wall, dust raining down. He dropped the feed sack and crouched low, rifle in hand, before he even thought. Outside, hooves pounded the trail, then faded just as quick. It wasn't an attack, not yet, just a warning. By the time he returned to the cabin, Nene was at the table, his spare rifle already laid out, rounds lined neatly beside it. Her hands moved steady, her face calm. Luke paused in the doorway watching her. "They didn't come close," he said. "They will," she answered, without looking up. And he knew she was right. That afternoon, smoke rose from the southern ridge. 5 riders this time, dust trailing behind them like a banner. Luke and Nene stood side by side at the cabin windows, rifles braced. The riders slowed at the gate, Keller at the lead. He dismounted, hands out, trying to wear calm like a cloak. "Bradock," he called. "This ain't about her anymore. It's about order. Give her up and we walk away clean." Luke stepped onto the porch, rifle steady at his side, his voice carried hard as stone. "She's not yours to punish. She never was." Keller's jaw clenched. One rider shifted, hand hovering over his holster. Luke raised his rifle quick, fired a shot clean enough to clip the man's hat from his head. Horses reared, men cursed. Luke's voice rolled across the dirt, low and certain. "I fought worse men than you, and I buried them farther from home than this. You try me. You won't walk away." For a long moment, the ridge held its breath. Then Keller spat into the dust, swung back into his saddle, and growled, "Let the damn fools rot." They turned, retreating in a cloud of dust. Inside, Nanny lowered her shotgun and leaned against the wall. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Next time, they won't talk first." Luke set his rifle aside, crossed to her, and took her hand. "Then we'll be ready." That night, they built more cover, stacked water buckets, laid cloths for fire. But in the quiet between preparations, they held each other close, bodies tangled beneath the blanket, their lovemaking slow, certain, like a vow spoken without words. When she touched the scar on his chest, she whispered, "I used to think love was just a trick of loneliness. Now it feels like staying." He kissed her hair, his voice low. "Then stay." The week that followed brought no riders, no gunfire. Raven Hollow had made its choice to let them rot, Oz Keller had spat, or to let them live unseen at the edge of the land. For Luke and Nanny, that silence was answer enough. They had stood their ground, and the world had backed away. One evening, when the sky burned red with sunset, Luke sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. Nanny stirred beans over the fire, her dress dusted from the day's work. She glanced over her shoulder, her voice soft. "I don't want to just survive anymore." Luke looked up, eyes catching hers. "Then we build something." Her lips curved faintly. "Small, but sure." He nodded once. "We already have." Weeks later, they rode into Raven Hollow together. Heads turned as Luke Bradock walked beside Nanny through the church doors. They didn't ask permission. They didn't seek approval. They signed the preacher's book and stood side by side. The townfolk watched in silence, but none spoke. The message was already clear. When Luke took her hand and led her back outside, the knot in his chest eased for the first time in years. On the ride home, he asked quietly, "You ever think we'd end up like this?" Nanny turned to him, her braid slipping over her shoulder. "No." He gave a small nod. "Me neither." She smiled, soft and certain. "That's what makes it good." Back at the cabin, the land looked the same, dry fields, sagging fences, a barn leaning to one side. But something had changed all the same. Inside those walls, a life had taken root. A garden turned under Nakini's hands, began to hold water. Green shoots pressed through the soil by spring. And one night, as she leaned against him by the hearth, her hand resting on her belly, she whispered, "I think I'm with child." Luke's breath caught. He kissed her hand, eyes steady, voice rough. "Then we'll raise one that knows what it means to stay." The fire cracked low, the wind pressed gentle through the grass, and for the first time in a long while, Luke Bradock felt the ache of war and loss ease into something else. Not forgetting, not forgiveness, but a life worth protecting, a life chosen piece by piece, day by day. The town never came for her again. They had made their judgment, and he had made his. She was no longer alone, and he was no longer silent. Together, they had chosen each other, and they had stayed.